comparative literature, his novel, Call Me By Your Name, was adapted for screen in 2017 to critical and popular acclaim. He writes for several leading publications. Vanessa Hua is a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle and the author of a novel as well as a collection of short stories. Her work has appeared in several leading publications. Dr. Vu Tran is a Vietnamese American writer. He is a criticism columnist, and his short stories have appeared in several prestigious collections. He teaches at the University of Chicago. This session has been brought to you in association with the University of Chicago. They will be in conversation with Sandip Roy. Sandip is a novelist and journalist currently living in Kolkata. His first novel, Don't Let Him Know, won the honor title for the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature and was also listed for other prestigious awards. His writings appear in leading publications regularly. Once again, this session is brought to you in association with the University of Chicago. If I could please have all the panelists on stage.
In Bengal, what happens is that people think that after 6 p.m., the dew falls on their head, and then they will catch a death of a cold and die of pneumonia instantly. So, these people who are here after 7 p.m. are braving life and limb to come here. So we should give them all a big round of applause for this. Thank you for coming to this session on flight and fiction. We're going to be talking about immigration and xenophobia and writing. And I was wondering before this panel as to how it would relate to audiences here. When you're in America, this is like the hot topic. Donald Trump's tweeting about it all the time. But here in India, when we think of immigrants, we're not used to that so much. We think maybe of, there's Bangladeshis coming across the border. That's one level of our kind of immigration story. But there's also the huge story of people that we know who are living in places like America and Australia as immigrants and what they face. And then there's the fact that in a city like Calcutta, where more and more people seem to leave, actually it's a city that's creating immigrants all the time. They just might be not immigrants to a different country, but they're in Bangalore or Delhi and stuff, which is, in a country like India, is an immigration of sorts. There is a cultural thing that's happening. I thought, since we have all three here, I'd start by asking them each a little bit about their work and sort of story, and then get the discussion going. So since, Vanessa, you're sitting right next to me, let me start with you. As somebody who grew up in a Chinese-American family, is there something you were, especially were your parents immigrants? Or
yeah, I'm the American-born daughter of Chinese immigrants, and they came to the US in the 60s as graduate students.
And so growing up, for them, they know very clearly we are immigrants. What is, for you, growing up in the US and therefore taking everything American around you, did you take it for granted, or were you always conscious that you were different, that your American came with a hyphen?
Yeah, definitely. I'm Chinese. I have a Chinese face. We were in our neighborhood. We were just not part of the dominant culture. My grandmother lived with us. She cured meat by hanging it in the rafters of the garage. Our neighbors certainly didn't do that. But I think for me, that's what drove me as a writer, understanding from very early on that there was a difference between the world inside my home and the world outside of it, and trying to figure out, following my curiosity out in the world, the things that my parents couldn't or wouldn't explain, I'd either have to find through books or through observation, and taking that imaginative leap of empathy towards understanding different lives. Then I knew from early on that just there were different ways of living.
So in balancing this world inside, the inside world and the outside world, can you give a few examples of how you kind of maneuvered that? I mean, did you have the issue that some people I know have talked about, which is the issue of what's in your lunchbox? The actor Kalpen Modi often talked about, people would make fun of what was in his lunchbox, especially after they saw a film like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and all the kids would come and say, do you have monkey brains in your lunchbox? Do you have monkey brains in your lunchbox? Did you have to face things like this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's this term we use in America, code switching, meaning you know how to use different languages, a different way of speaking the same language in different contexts. So for me, even as early as the first grade, the teacher went around the class to teach us how to make conversation. Oh, what did you have for breakfast? And everyone around me is saying Cheerios, oatmeal, pancakes, waffles, all very typical American breakfast. But my parents had made me Campbell's beef barley canned soup. And so I don't know if in India, I don't know if soup would be common or uncommon for breakfast.
Not common for breakfast at all.
So, but I knew innately that that was not the answer I could give. And so when it got around to me, I said Cheerios. I lied so I could feel like I could fit in. So maybe that's where my fiction writing began.
With a lie about breakfast.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Andre, in terms of your story, which you've written about in your memoir, Out of Egypt, you were born and raised in Egypt, but I read that when people asked you your nationality, you would say French.
Yes,
Why?
I was lying.
You were lying too. This is actually a panel about lying. We've just called it flight and...
No, I was lying. Is this working? Yes. I was lying because I thought I was French. There was absolutely no reason why I wouldn't be French. I spoke French. The culture at home was French. We despised everybody else because, like the French... No, that's not true. I shouldn't say things like this. Yes. But basically, initially it was French. Then somebody stopped me and said, no, you're not French. You're Turkish. And I had only heard bad things about Turks because my family comes from Turkey. They escaped Turkey. So in essence, I had become like the enemy. What it did for me, however, and we can discuss this later, is that it made me aware that whatever sort of nationality I claimed or wanted to have was going to be the wrong one. Which means that I didn't have a nationality, which means that I also didn't have a religion because I didn't believe in my religion. And so I had none of those things that help you become some kind of established human being. In fact, I don't like religions, any of them, and I certainly don't like nationalism of any sort. And patriotism, we're listening to patriotic songs, okay? So patriotism for me is a totally foreign concept. And so in America, okay? I've lived in America for 50 years, so I should know better. But they revere the flag. The flag should never touch the ground. If it touches the ground, you have to throw it away. So there is a love of the flag, and frankly, I have never loved a single flag. The only flag I liked was the Brazilian one because it's beautiful. And so I wanted a flag of Brazil, but I'm not Brazilian by any means. So the identity that is sort of sanctioned by where you're born, on the other hand, let me just jump to this. I was born in Egypt, but I was not Egyptian. I thought I was French, but I was really Turkish. So everything was wrong. And that's why I'm a fiction writer, because fundamentally I'm...
Well, if you had come here during the World Cup, you would have seen this city covered in flags of Brazil and Argentina, and there was no Indian flags there because everybody was, for that moment, became Brazilian or Argentine or whatever they think. But so tell the audience a little bit about why your family had to leave Egypt.
We had to leave because they kicked us out. We didn't have quite a choice. I think my father, if he had had his way, even after they nationalized his factory and they took away all his assets and his cars and everything, he would still have liked to stay in Egypt because he understood Egypt. And he had made a life of himself among Egyptians. He was happy there. And that was it. But of course, once they nationalize you and they take away everything you have, the next step is for them to kick you out, and they did. And we were kicked out, and we ended up in Italy. because ironically, we had purchased the Italian passport. So from a French person and a Turk, I became an Italian refugee in Italy, which I hated. I hated being a refugee, and I hated Italy. So everything was going at cross currents. It took me a long time, not to resolve the problem, but to find ways of healing from it.
So before I go to, I'm curious as to when you're in Egypt and and everything is going well, if you have a certain status in society that you take for granted, a certain kind of lifestyle and all of that, and privilege that comes with it, and then you go to Italy and you're a refugee. Like, how did you adjust?
Look at me. Do I look adjusted to you? No. No, I think I did. I never adjusted. The shock has, basically, you know how to work around the shock, but you don't actually resolve it by any means. The only thing I knew how to do was to simply, and I remember doing this very, very frequently, is to not only shut the window, but shut the shutters. So I wouldn't have to look outside. And I would turn on the light and I would read novels. In other words, sort of find a hollow space in which you can recreate your identity or reimagine it as you wish it could be. And by reading books, and books of fiction particularly, which was fantastic because I read the best fiction in the world, which was always by dead people. In fact, I still like dead writers. But thank you.
Because they don't go to lit fests and ruin the illusion.
Well, that's another thing. But frankly, it was my way of just refusing to understand that I had become a pauper, because actually we had become very poor, and relying on the kindness of uncles and aunts who had money, and who basically, whenever somebody gives you money, they don't give you money, they give you obligations that come with the money, and they become horrible and intolerant. So anyway.
Vu, your story, you were 4 years old when you came to America?
That's right.
So, and your father, who was with the South Vietnamese Air Force, had left after the fall of Saigon. And so tell the story of how your mother managed. So, you go there that young, when you're 4. So did you actually have memories of the camp or your life before America?
Not really. I mean, fragments. And this is inevitable with anyone, that sometimes your memories or the stories that your parents tell you become your memories, and sometimes you can't tell what is actually yours. But yeah, my first extended memory is of my first day in America.
Which was the what? What was it like?
Which was my father, he had bought a house, and he led me to the kitchen and made me a bologna sandwich. He toasted the bread. He microwaved the bologna, which is kind of disgusting, but I have since always liked it that way. Gave me sweet and sour, sour cream and onion Ruffles chips, and 7-Up.
Which is here they call it American cream.
American cream?
Cream and onion.
Good
That's
God.
a sour cream and onion.
That sounds terrible. But yeah, that was my very first breakfast in America. And then I went into my bedroom, my new bedroom, and played with on some plastic duck that you rode around. And that was my first morning. And that's my first extended memory that I have. Yeah.
So Vanessa, when your book that you have 2 books out, but the novel which the last night you were describing as a pregnant Asian Thelma and Louise. You write about these women who have come to America, pregnant Chinese women, who've come to America to have their babies on American soil in these kind of maternity homes or something. So I know...
So their kids will get U.S. citizenship.
So that the kids will get U.S. citizenship by being born on U.S. soil, which sounds like... Has Donald Trump read this book?
Right. He's in fact created a whole platform against it.
Has he read any book?
Right.
We had a session with Yann Martel yesterday, who for 4 years had sent a book every 2 weeks to Stephen Harper, hoping he would read, to expand his mind. And he sent 102 books. And I asked him, did you ever hear back from Stephen Harper? But he said, zilch. He never responded. So then I asked him, what would you send Donald Trump? And he said, I don't know. And then we decided maybe we'd start with Dr. Seuss, Green Eggs and Ham or something.
That's difficult book.
A picture book. Yes.
That is a difficult. Green eggs, what are green eggs? You know, that sounds foreign to me. Yeah, so I know you had been a reporter in the community in San Francisco, reported on Asian American. So are these kinds of maternity homes or hospitals something that was actually happening, or did you make this up?
So, my kids now are 7 years old, but when I was pregnant with my twins, I was living in Southern California at the time, and I began hearing about these maternity centers. That is, the neighbors were wondering why all these pregnant Chinese women were showing up in the suburbs week by week, why the whole street smelled like stir fry and the garbage cans were overflowing with diapers. To me, it sounded like a brothel in reverse. And it turned out it was, as I said, they were coming here to give birth so their kids would get U.S. citizenship. But being that I was pregnant at the time myself, I knew it's one of the most vulnerable times in a woman's life. And I wondered, what was it about U.S. citizenship that would make them come so far from friends and family to do this? And in fact, the practice still goes on. If you go to globalbaby7.com, you can pick your choice of accommodations.
Really?
Yes, in Irvine or in the San Gabriel Valley. There's a Canada option and even a Saipan option. Apparently, if you're born on U.S. territory, you're also eligible. I mean, this is a practice that beyond these maternity centers have been going on for decades. And, families if there are the means, will come to the U.S. to do it, whether they're from Russia or China or Korea or even India. And so I think the misunderstanding is that the parents are doing this in the same way that you would, say, purchase a savings bond for your child. It's just an insurance policy for later, because just who knows what would happen. And I mean, I think something that I've thought about both with this novel and as a journalist who's been covering the Asian American community in Asia for 2 decades, it's this whole question of how nationality and identity, they're no longer synonymous. Where you were born is not necessarily the nationality you carry, not necessarily even the passport you carry. You have cases of white Americans who say, oh, Granny was from Ireland. I think I want an EU passport. Or one of the co-founders of Facebook, Eduardo Savarine, Brazilian-born, became a U.S. citizen, then gave it up to become a Singaporean permanent resident so he could get a better tax credit, or tax benefit. So I think we have reached a stage where it's like this whole question of like, these things are not synonymous anymore, and I think my novel explores that.
And your novel, Dragonfish, it is, it's set in Las Vegas. There is crime, so it has characters who are immigrants.
That's right.
But if it's described to, if it's shelved under immigrant novel, what would you feel?
Well, how would I feel if it was shelved under an immigrant novel? Well, I mean, I've always thought of it as either an immigrant novel in the guise of a crime novel, or a crime novel in the guise of an immigrant novel. As long as it's shelved, I don't mind.
As long as it's shelved.
As long as it's purchased.
Or, I would prefer it be purchased off the shelf. I wouldn't mind.
But tell us, because people haven't read the novel, tell us a little bit about the premise of the novel.
Well, basically the premise, the protagonist is actually a white American police officer who was married to a Vietnamese woman, a tumultuous marriage, and she has since left him as the novel begins. And he has found out that she has remarried, but has remarried a Vietnamese man in Las Vegas, who is a gambler, an unsavory man. And she has gone either missing or disappeared intentionally. And through a series of events, he is now forcing the protagonist, who is a police officer, to search for his ex-wife. And in many ways, I find myself identifying as much with him as with any of the Vietnamese characters in the novel, because it's the majority of the characters are Vietnamese, but he is the center of the novel in some ways, in many ways, as a protagonist. I've always thought, America of all places should be able to understand immigration because, you know, on some level, people immigrate all the time, especially in a country like America where it's, you know, it's so vast and there's so many different cultures and even, you know, environments that, you know, the way people move, they should understand what it's like to be in a new world, you know.
So where do you think this fear that somebody like Donald Trump is articulating comes from? Because on one level, a politician in America will proudly talk about their immigrant roots, hopefully, but it's about the, you know, my grandparents came here from wherever, $50 in their pocket, you know, American dream made it possible for me to now run for president or senator. And yet, this, after, when you say of all people, Americans should understand it, but where do you think this great unease that has been unleashed by the last election comes from?
Well, I mean, there's so many ways to discuss that. I mean, but it's, at the end of the day, very elemental. It's something that I think all human beings have, which is that, you know, things like tradition, religion, but in this case, that idea of stability is very important to everyone. And Donald Trump kind of represents that kind of stability. So so people think. I think that's, I mean, it's not just Donald Trump, obviously, but that discomfort with immigrants, I think, basically comes from that, because it threatens that idea of a stable Americanism, right?
I want to ask each of you, you know, at this particular moment in American history, what is the role of a writer in talking about immigration and all of that? But before that, Andre, let me ask you, do you think in some sense, even a book like Call Me By Your Name, even though the person there is not an immigrant, technically is a student who has come for a period to it, but in a certain way, if you look at it, is it like an immigrant novel?
If you want to stretch the point, yes.
But in two ways, is immigrant into both a cultural, but there's also a sexuality immigration that is happening.
Right, it's totally true. The thing that sort of I'm going to add to what you said is that one of the things that is threatened, or at least perceived as a threat, is the fact that a person who comes to the United States has a different culture. And that culture is entirely different from the culture of the small American town. New York is a totally unusual case. But so there is a sense of a fear that the culture is so different and the way they speak is so different that they don't belong here. And you see that in every single Western cowboy movie where the stranger walks into town on a horse, arrives on a horse, and everybody stares at him because he's different. He's an outsider. And the experience of the outsider is, I think, endemic to anybody who comes to the United States as a refugee, an immigrant, or even a person who stays over after their visa expires.
Which most people don't realize are actually the majority of people who are in America without papers, because I think the vision we have is of people crossing the border, you know, stealthily. But really, most people who are quote unquote described as illegal immigrants are actually people who've overstayed their papers, and that Indians are the fastest growing group in that category.
Yes.
Yeah, 40 to 60% of the undocumented population came in with valid visas that they overstayed. That they
overstayed. So, in that sense, Andre, as somebody who has moved and from Egypt to Italy and then now in US, this idea of nostalgia. Because at one level you're talking about people from small town America who have this memory of a time, the drugstore and all their neighbors look like them.
Norman Rockwell.
Yes, Norman Rockwell.
Right.
And I remember a New Yorker article during the immigration debates where an elderly lady says she's really upset by the neighbors who move in, who are mostly Hispanic, in a small town. And she says, they're really nice people, but I'm really upset because before the people who used to stay, I used to play card games with them, And now these people play other kinds of games I don't understand. And I thought that was, both kind of poignant and so this idea of nostalgia, both are, immigrants are often described as, being nostalgic about the country they've left
Yes.
behind. And these people, Americans, are in the country of their origin, but they're still nostalgic for something that they feel is irrevocably changing. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about this idea of nostalgia.
Well, nostalgia is, it's a complicated emotion because it is a yearning to go back to something that is perceived either that is lost or that is dormant. In other words, it has been taken away from you or you have left it, but you may possibly be going back eventually, which most immigrants seldom do. In other words, it's sort of the dream of the perfect paradise that you have lost and that you're going to go back to once you've made enough money. That's usually the trajectory of the story. But then there's the nostalgia of the person who is embedded in this, who basically grew up in America and feels that these strange people do strange things and they're not what I want to see near my house. And, you can understand them. You can understand because they don't understand what these people are doing. The Russians who live right next door to you have huge parties and they drink a lot. Okay, and you're used to nobody doing anything like that on Saturday night. So I can understand her position, but you want to say, grow up, lady. This is the way. Yeah,
Learn the card games. Maybe they'll let you
Learn
join
new
in a
games,
canasta game.
Yeah. Play dominoes, okay?
So when you talk about yearning to go back, the first time you went back to Alexandria, what did it feel like for you?
Terrible. Because I was going back, I had just written a book about leaving Egypt, and I went back 30 years later, and I was walking down the streets of Alexandria, and I'm recognizing the city, and I'm very disappointed in the city, and I'll explain to you why. But I'm walking around, and I did the tour of all the hot spots of my childhood in the sort of the downtown area. After about 12, 15 minutes, I had finished the tour. I should have taken a plane back because I had done all the quote-unquote errands that, nostalgists like to do. So that was it. But I saw a city that was very much the same. All the buildings were still there. I never once, after 30 years, got lost. So it was the same exact thing. I took long, long walks, hoping that I would eventually have to stop someone and say, how do I get to such and such? I never had to. I never got lost. The thing that changed, however, and I think I was speaking to somebody earlier today about population exchanges, is that everybody was different. I was used to a city that was very different because it had Greeks, it had Armenians, Italians, Jews, French, English people, and suddenly they had all disappeared. They had all gone away. There was only Egyptians left, which should make sense. It is, after all, their city, their country. But I felt, God, I was an outsider 30 years ago because I couldn't belong here, and now I'm a total phantom walking down these streets because nobody is interested in me. I can't talk to anybody. I know some Arabic, so I could talk to people, but I didn't want to because I felt that there was nothing that bound me to this place. So I was twice eager to leave, and I couldn't leave because the next plane was leaving in 5 days.
I think people here would relate to that because, Calcutta, once people would famously talk about, was a city that had a lot of Chinese and Jews and Armenians and Bengalis, and all those populations have disappeared over the years, and it's become a Bengali and maybe Marwari city, with a bit of, but the things that people prided Calcutta on its sort of cosmopolitanism has definitely changed. But Vanessa, for your parents, was there immigrant nostalgia about China? Were you taken on a pilgrimage back to the mother country ever?
Well, their history was complicated, as a lot of family histories are, by the fact that World War II, was throughout their childhood. They were always moving every few months ahead of enemy lines, and then finally, before the communist victory, my parents ended up in Taiwan, but they would never identify as Taiwanese American. They were Chinese who happened to be on the island of Taiwan, and then came to the U.S. And so, by this point, my father's already passed away. My mother has lived in the U.S. for more than half her life, and she, we don't have any family left back. Everyone has immigrated to the U.S. And in some ways, so Chinese New Year is coming up next week, Year of the Pig, guys. And it was only as I became an adult that I became more interested in, say, traditions like getting a haircut, new clothes, cleaning up the house. And my mother said to me, oh, you're teaching me some of the traditions. So in some way, her generation was the one, for her, she's a scientist. She was very forward focused. She was not looking back. Her life was here now, and so, but it is that thing of the American-born child that perhaps you wonder, like, what was left behind? And then so that caused me to sort of reach back and do reporting from China as a journalist, and then later on to set some of my stories and my novel in China as well.
What did people in China make of you as a Chinese American there?
They asked if I was Malaysian or Japanese, or they asked, like, how do you speak Chinese or how do you speak English so well? They were flabbergasted. I'm like, because I don't speak Chinese very well. So, I think definitely I remember I was on an exchange program in Taiwan, and one of the daughters I was staying with looked at me and said, "Why are you so black?" And I said, "Oh," I was tan. So I said, "Oh," in my simple Chinese, I said, "I like the sun. That is why."
And they're horrified, like, what kind of freak are you?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
What about you? For Vietnamese, which people probably get here, is that history of immigration is much more fraught because of the war that happened. So a lot of people who ended up in the US were the ones on the losing side of that war. And so, but you are growing up there, you don't really have much memory of Vietnam the way your father's generation did.
No,
so
no.
Was your attitude towards or curiosity about Vietnam different from the way your parents regarded Vietnam?
Yes, because I needed material.
So
as
Vietnam
a writer,
was material for you.
And so I kind of, I'm very glad I approached it that way, because I ended up really connecting with that culture, Vietnamese culture, in ways I would not have. What I found interesting is that, so my mom has been in America 35 years now. My dad has been there over 40 years. And about 10 years ago, I realized, that they have been in America longer than they had grown up in Vietnam. And yet they still identify as Vietnamese in ways that, someone who never left would have, right? And I just found that interesting because the Vietnam that they would tell me about and the Vietnam that they imposed on me is no longer that Vietnam at all. I mean, they've been back many times.
To Vietnam?
But they still, and so they know what contemporary Vietnam is like, but it's so different, and it's moved on from them. And sometimes when I think of it in that light, I find it rather sad. And so when I look for a Vietnam, I try to look for one that has moved beyond theirs in a way.
But at least they go back, because I had a Vietnamese American friend whose father, refused. He's just like, I cannot ever go back to Vietnam, even as he has like parents, immense, probably considers himself Vietnamese through and through, but is unable to step back into that country.
Yeah, it's hard for people. It's hard for people because number one, a lot of their family is gone, right? So who and what are you coming back for? And a lot of my family have since moved to Canada or to Australia. I mean, I still have a lot of family there, but that's what makes home,
And when you go back to Vietnam, how are you regarded? Nobody asks you if you're Malaysian or something, do they?
No. Well, I haven't been back in a long time. They always ask me, well, when I used to come, first time I came back, I was 18, I was really skinny, and they were like, why are you so skinny? You live in America, you should be fat and healthy, Yeah.
Did you know that the American consulate in Calcutta is the name of the street it's on? The American consulate in Kolkata.
No.
Do you know the name of the street?
No.
Take a guess. It has a Vietnamese connection.
Saigon Road.
No, much better. It's named Ho Chi Minh Road.
Oh, yeah. Ho Chi Minh is a bit of a, for certain people. In
Well,
India,
we had a
he's
communist
bit of
government at that
yeah.
time here, and so they very deliberate. So that street used to be called Harrington Street, but because as a communist government they wanted to teach the American and British consulate are both on that street, so they decided we will name this street Ho Chi Minh Street, so that all letters and official correspondence from the American embassy has to go out from Ho Chi Minh Street.
Really, right.
So before we go to the audience question, I wanted to ask each of you, this idea of the immigrant novel that came out in America, which was initially a story of reinvention. You go to America, you shed something, Bharati Mukherjee's Jasmine was the classic example where you go with one name and your name keeps changing to ultimately she becomes Jasmine, Jazzy, Jane, or whatever. And that was the story of shedding skins, acquiring new skins. Now, with everything that's been happening, do you see those tropes changing? Are there new kinds of immigrant novels and stories that are coming up and coming out? Any of you can go first, whoever wants to take it.
Well, I think there's a kind of triumphalist strain in the old immigrant story. We came to America, we despoiled ourselves of the old stuff, it was no good anyway, we're building a new life here, our children are going to become dentists, and so on. The dentistry is a very important profession, trust me, I go to one every week. But this is the old story. The new story is far more complex because it evokes the tragedy that made the immigrant story possible, as in yours. There's also another Vietnamese story it's called, I think, The Boat. You must have read it.
Nam Le.
Yeah, and it's the same thing. And it's a horrific story, and therefore you come to America and you settle, and you become nostalgic, which is, if you look at The Godfather, for example, for those of you who have seen the movie, The Godfather has a sort of an immigrant strain in it. But it's basically Michael is only in Sicily because he's committed a murder. Otherwise, he would be in New York, and that was the end of that. He's not Italian. And when he marries an Italian woman as a fantasy, she gets blown up. All right, so that's the end of it. I also think that there's a new strain, another strain, which I find particularly satisfying, to use that word. It's the strain that you see in a book called The Emigrants. I don't know how many of you have read it. It's by a German who lives in England and lived in England for most of his life, came to England as a professor, and wrote a book about the dislodgement that you feel, not only because you've lost your country, that's an old trope, but the dislodgement and dispossession you feel because there is something about time that sets you apart. And you're always going to be set apart, not because you don't play the card game that your neighbors used to play, but because there's something that's pulling you out of what is normally considered tradition. And you're always going to be a stranger. Guys?
Well, I think there's that trope of the immigrant striver, but that is very much focused on the individual and overcoming the obstacles. And I think there is a greater understanding of, say, structural things like racism or sexism, even though you're not writing some, public policy paper with your novel, but there's an acknowledgement of larger forces at play that need to be the characters need to be grounded in that to kind of, if you're doing a realistic novel, that these are these larger forces that go beyond what any one person might set out to try and achieve for themselves, even though that is the American dream, that is what gets you up every day, this thought that you can have social mobility. But yet there are these other things that you walk into as an immigrant or a refugee that were already in play before you arrived. So.
It seems to me there's a movement towards the immigrant novel writing, focusing much more on what it means to be, America and American. I think perhaps the older immigrant novel focused more on the past and the weight of the past, which obviously is important. But the lens now is on America through the point of view of people who've been here a few generations, right? I mean, I've always thought, when I was growing up, I had a perfectly fine upbringing in Oklahoma, but, there were frustrations, and I would always think that I was unlucky for being so different from everybody else. But the older I've gotten, I realized, that I quite liked being on the outside of things, especially as a writer or as an artist. When you're on the inside, you're perfectly comfortable. You don't really look at things with a particularly curious eye. But when you're on the periphery, looking in and wanting to be on the inside, you end up looking at it with a much more thoughtful, critical I mean, for example, talking about America, the American dream, for example, is a very real thing, but we don't often want to talk about how the American dream is based partly on deception, especially self-deception, right? And it's things like that that I think growing up the way I did has allowed me to have access or approach things in a certain light that I might not have done if I already looked like everyone else.
But do you ever feel frustrated that, those 4.5 years that you don't really remember very well, do you find that people try to define you by that?
Oh, sure.
So is that annoying?
No, because I feel it's human, I mean, I do it. That's what
But that's material for you. It's different.
Like I said, if everyone stopped to think about it for a while, I mean, it depends on what country you're from. But, everybody should be able to identify with the immigrant experience. Because, when you go to a new school, when you move to a new town, when you get married, we all have these kinds of rebirths. And they're traumatizing on different levels. And if you could just access that trauma, or that discomfort, or that newness, that alienness of things, you'd be able to understand, the immigrant experience on a certain level.
Yeah, I mean, I can always imagine, my mother getting married, from very cosmopolitan Calcutta, and my father's an engineer in the forest somewhere. What is that but immigration? So let's just take a couple of quick questions, and then we'll wind up. Yes, sir. I think someone will get you a mic.
Hi, Bikram here. Questions to Andre, but it applies to all three of you. Isn't being compartmentalized the new normal? I mean, if you look at the cities across the globe, for example, Calcutta, which used to have a huge Jewish population, today has hardly 10 or 12 families. Baghdad, Jerusalem, Cairo, Nairobi, all across the world. Then why is the literature focusing on only one country and complaining about one country having distancing immigrants, which is America, or maybe to an extent Europe? Because the rest of the world is behaving like that. I mean, people are being pushed out of every country, and like you mentioned, Cairo. I mean, I've been Nairobi. I mean, it's everywhere the same thing. Why complain?
Why complain? Because it's very painful. First of all, the fact that you have been dislodged, or that you have chosen to be dislodged. And these are two totally different experiences, the one it's forced on you and when you decide to do it yourself. The fact that you have moved from one culture, one place, one sunshine to another sunshine is painful. It requires a lot of adjustment. And older people, by the way, do not adjust. They are always sort of being pulled back. They will not accept the present. And what I've noticed when my father, as he was dying, he became a bit sort of senescent, and he was calling the streets by the wrong names, but it wasn't Fifth Avenue. It was names from Egyptian cities, Egyptian streets. So he was not being pulled back. He had never left, as far as he was concerned. So it is a painful experience, and it's a painful experience for the offspring as well. If you're young enough to remember what it was like, what your life was already inscribed on you of what it was going to be, when you realize that inscription in you, then you say, my God, I'm over here and I should have been over there, and there's no way to get back there, so I might as well make this my home, but I'm doing it with a sort of reluctance. And that reluctance never leaves. It has never left me. So whenever I walk in New York, I'm always thinking, oh my God, look at this sidewalk with this little park. It reminds me of my home in Egypt. Why am I doing that? It is of no purpose. And there are a lot of people who are from Egypt who would tell me, would you stop wasting your time doing this? It is of no value to anyone. But it comes to me very naturally.
Yeah, so that.
Name's K.S. Nair, Shankar Nair rather,
It's
from fiction to reality check. Now, Mrs. Angela Merkel will vouch for it. She opened the floodgates. A million walked in or shipped in, and she had to pay a high price for it. Political career came to an abrupt end. I mean, will be rather. The fourth term will not be followed by a fifth. And it's generally observed that immigrants don't assimilate well. And to which I'm playing the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
And
So what's the question? Do you?
it's an observation, a comment. I mean, it wasn't a question to be.
Okay. Well, it's let me put it to you guys. I mean, first of all, do you agree that immigrants don't assimilate well?
Well, it depends, doesn't it? What exactly do you mean by assimilating well?
And there's no
You know.
generally.
Yeah. I mean, you can assimilate well in many ways, but on the surface seem like you haven't assimilated at all. Particularly if you still look different, right?
That you're not going to be able to change.
So sometimes assimilation is physical. You know, how well are you assimilating to the look of the new world? You know, I mean, so it can be very superficial.
Yeah, like a realtor in San Jose named Bhavesh always called himself Bob in the back. But on the Indian magazines, he would say Bob bracket Bhavesh, so you knew he was an Indian person you could trust.
Now, at the same time, I had parents who would always complain about Vietnamese people who would come to California, live in Little Saigon,
And never
not
step
learn
out.
English, and never move outside of that space, and that would frustrate them. So I do understand that there are certain levels of assimilation that might not seem satisfactory to both the people in the New World and people of those communities.
So, given what people were talking, what the gentleman raised in his question, but now, given the amount of dialogue that's happening around race and immigration in America, thanks to Donald Trump, Vanessa, do you think Donald Trump might actually prove good to push people into writing a different kind of immigrant novel? Because he's exploded like a bomb in America, and there could be a literary fallout of it, which could be interesting to watch.
Well, it's been said that people have been saying, is it harder to write fiction now because we have a president that sort of is so absurd and far outstrips anything that if a novelist attempted to write in a character like that, we'd be all sort of told this is unrealistic. And so Trump has, in fact, trumped it. But I mean, I still think fiction is really important, particularly since immigrants are often reduced to stereotypes and statistics. And it's with fiction that we have this possibility of trying to imagine another life. Have you heard of this study that readers of literary fiction are thought to be more empathetic? And literary fiction in particular, because literary fiction doesn't follow formulas, that it challenges us with a character that may not fit into your existing worldview. So I think that's where fiction, you had kind of brought this up earlier, where it can be really powerful, that if you're reading nonfiction or a newspaper article, you're like, okay, I'm taking my medicine. This is what I'm supposed to be doing to be a good citizen, to understand the world. But with fiction, if you journey along with a character for a while, that character still only stands in for themselves, but you at least have expanded your capacity for trying to understand that someone else might see the world differently than you.
Unfortunately, we are out of time because we've actually run over time. So I know there are hands up there. Does someone have a very short, succinct question? Wait, one of you will get it. Just give a mic to that person, the young man there, and you're going to get the last question. Make it brief. Make it a question. And make it a question.
Yeah, hi. my question is to Andre. Yesterday you mentioned that, when you gave the manuscript of Call Me By Your Name to your agent and she said, why did you write a gay book? So how do you deal with criticism when, criticism for writing, attempting to representation of a community which you're not part of, like, when you get a lot of flake for it, I'm guessing.
Yeah, but I mean, that's what fiction writers do. They always do that. I mean, Dostoevsky wrote a book about a man killing 2 women. Trust me, he never killed anyone, okay? But it's a bad analogy, okay? No, I wanted to go there, because I was always interested in the subject. And I had, when I was very, very young, about 9 years old, there was a guy that I wanted to become a friend with. And he was the expert volleyball player. And I always wanted to become his friend. And he was much, much older. He was about 18 or so. And that remained with me. It was like an unsolved issue that I decided I'm going to write about this. And then I said, no, you can't have a child of 8, 9 years old doing this sort of thing. Because I had no idea what I wanted from him, probably nothing. But so I decided to make him 17. And I got in trouble for the 17 too. Okay, so... but it was my way of opening up into a field that, was new to me. But you can do anything you want if you have a good imagination. It's there.
And on that note, you can do anything you want if you have good imagination. We have to end this session. Thank you so much for staying with us.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, great job.
Now we have to do that other thing. Are you doing this?
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And that brings us to the end of day 3 of Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet 2019. See you back tomorrow for another very full day of very interesting sessions and performances. Thank you so much. Good night.